Hello and welcome to Anglia Late Edition, back again after our enforced break and suitably socially distanced. On tonight's programme, it's not another lockdown, but social gatherings of more than 6 are outlawed, and is the promised moonshot of mass testing just pie in the sky? More strict local measures are still on the cards in the COVID hotspots across the eastern counties. Plus, is it OK to break the law if it's just in a specific and limited way? The latest battle lines over Brexit. To talk to us about all of that, I'm joined tonight by the Essex MP Sir Bernard Jenkin for the Conservatives and Labour's Sarah Owen, who's one of the 2 Luton MPs. We'll hear from them in a moment. But first, not a second lockdown, says the Prime Minister, but it will split families again and hit social events. Gatherings of more than 6 people have been banned outside of work, education or organised sport. Boris Johnson is pinning hopes on his so-called moonshot mass testing programme for getting back to normality. But as new COVID cases continue to emerge across the Anglia region, experts have raised doubts about the plan. David Hughes reports.
Our world has changed beyond measure in the past few months. For every gain forward, some steps in reverse. Like back in March, the Prime Minister again this week had to address the nation.
You must not meet socially in groups of more than 6, and if you do, you will be breaking the law.
Not another lockdown, but not much of a step towards normality either.
These measures are not another national lockdown. The whole point of them is to avoid a second national lockdown.
And there's still confusion.
My understanding was that it was supposed to be groups of 6 anyway.
People are just not doing what they should be doing.
The actual conditions that they've imposed are good.
This is very confusing because how big is a family? 6 people? Can it be 7 people? Or it's very confusing. It is.
Mixed messages, ridiculous. The government haven't got a clue what they're doing.
The new clampdown coming into force on Monday follows thousands more coronavirus cases across the country. In the Anglia region in the past week, there have been 949 positive tests, the kind of weekly totals not seen since May. Generally, infection rates in the east of England are lower than nationally, but there are hotspots like Corby, Northampton and Peterborough, where there are more than 20 cases per 100,000. That's the threshold being used to gauge whether overseas travel corridors should be closed. The government is now pinning its hopes for a move towards normality on their mass testing programme.
They use swabs or saliva. They can be turned around in 90 minutes or even 20 minutes. The so-called Operation Moonshot to deploy mass testing will allow people to lead more normal lives and reduce the need for social distancing. We're piloting this approach right now and verifying the new technology, and then it can be rolled out nationwide. And Mr. Speaker, I'm going to depart from my script here because I've heard the naysayers before, and I've heard the people on the other side complain we'll never get testing going. And they're the same old voices.
Mass testing is too important to become another failed project. It's all well and good, him talking about moonshots and the Prime Minister telling us we'll be tested every morning. Even better would be simply delivering the extra testing that is needed now, not just headline figures.
The time frame for this mass testing is unclear, but according to leaked documents, it could see 10 million tests a day and cost £100 billion.
So with us tonight, Sir Bernard Jenkin, Essex MP and chair of the powerful Liaison Committee, which gets to quiz the Prime Minister every now and then. In fact, he's up before them next week. And newly elected in December, Sarah Owen is one of the 2 Labour MPs for Luton, a town that's one of the region's coronavirus hotspots, and cases there are growing again. Welcome to both of you. First of all, Sir Bernard, is there a sense that we're moving backwards, that the government quite haven't got a handle on this? Because we were seeing restrictions eased over the summer and suddenly cases are rising and restrictions are tightening again.
To some extent, yes, but we've seen this in every country in Europe. Every country has seen a rise. Other countries seen more of a rise. Other countries like France and Spain seem to have a rise ahead of us and have been slower to apply additional restrictions like this than we have. We're hoping to stay ahead of this rise so it doesn't turn into a second wave. And if I can just clarify one point that rose in the video, the it's a maximum of 6, but if your household is already bigger than 6, obviously you can have your whole family if you've got more family than 6. But if you're going to have...
Do you think the message is still confusing and complex? That's what we were hearing from
well,
people as
well.
the
government's got a difficult problem.
On the one hand, if you've got a family of more than 6, fine, but you can have more households now meeting. So for some people, this is a loosening of restrictions.
No, I don't think it is. But the difficulty is to make one-size-fits-all rules for everybody. You can't do that, can you? So, the government makes the messaging as simple as possible, but read the small print on the government website. Ask for advice if you need it from friends or colleagues who are good at reading these sort of things. It's been very carefully thought through. It is confusing. Let's face it, people's lives are confusing. There can't be a one solution that fits everybody's circumstances. It's very difficult. In the end, common sense and reasonable. No one's going to get fined for doing the right thing. If you've tried to do the right thing, you won't get fined.
We'll come back to that in a minute. First of all, let's go to Sarah. Is it a confusing message? Because, of course, in Luton we have seen a rise in cases again. And how concerned are you about that?
I'm very concerned about the hugely confusing messages and the mixed messages that are coming out from government. What we've heard recently is that young people are being blamed for these increase in spikes of infections, yet they were encouraged to eat out, to help out. They're encouraged to go back to university, back to work, and now they're being blamed for these spikes of coronavirus. And what we really need to see is proper testing in the areas that it's needed, close to people that want to get tested, and we need a track and trace system in place. We were promised that many, many months ago. We are way behind other countries, and that's what we need to get ahead of this curve.
And we saw Matt Hancock there in the Commons, Labour MPs openly laughing when he suggested that people might be able to just be tested every day, when at the moment we're hearing stories about people having to travel, in some cases 350 miles, or being offered tests at 350 miles away.
Which says there's not enough testing, which is why we need easier testing. The important thing about what the government's proposing to invest in now is these very quick tests, these on-the-spot tests that take a few minutes instead of having to send the swab off to a lab and wait for days. That's the kind of testing we need. It's still being pioneered and developed. Yes, you can be very cynical and say, oh, well, we don't believe anything you say. And, of course, the safe thing for the opposition to keep saying is we need more testing and more track and trace, because they're right. But we're delivering it as quickly as possible.
But
yes,
we are
it would have been nice to do it
6-7 months
quicker.
down into a pandemic, and you are just piloting this now.
Well,
the WHO have been saying that testing and tracing is a key way to control the virus from the very beginning of the pandemic. And we have a government
now. Where in the world are they using this kind of test? It's a new test. How can we be blamed for not
There's
deploying
been
a test
mass
that isn't
testings
available?
in many countries where they've been able to prevent the scale of deaths and infections that we've seen in this country.
I think that the answer is there are all kinds of circumstances that have made us vulnerable. One of the problems right at the beginning was perhaps not locking down soon enough and misunderstanding what this virus was, because the whole planning
process. In terms of
process.
messaging, that people were told we didn't need to wear masks, and then we did. We were slow behind the curve on that one. As you say, potentially we locked down late. Potentially that cost lives. Are you concerned about how this has been handled if we look back at the past 5 months?
I think there's going to be an enormous amount to learn. One of the biggest lessons is the pandemic planning that was developed under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, in previous governments. It was always based on a flu pandemic, not a coronavirus pandemic. And I think it took a long time for the system to adapt.
Gordon Brown was Prime Minister more than 10 years ago, and yet this came.
But I mean, even Tony Blair has said the mistakes the government has made up until now are forgivable errors. It's all very well being wise after the event, but I thought it was a very wise thing for Tony Blair to say. What we've got to make sure is we get it right this time. And it's the easiest thing in the world for opposition politicians to carry on sniping, much more difficult for the government to get it right.
This isn't about blame, this is about accountability and making sure that we get it right in the future. And that means having to look where we've got it wrong over the last 6 months. I know that things have moved incredibly quickly, and any government would have found it difficult. But I think the government has to really accept responsibility for where it has got things wrong.
Thank you for saying that.
So from there, let's look. We've looked at the handling of it. Let's look about what comes next. What lessons should we learn? For many years, the former North Norfolk MP, Sir Norman Lamb, looked after the health brief for the Liberal Democrats. He also served as a health minister in the coalition government and is now, outside of politics, chair of an NHS mental health trust. I spoke to him earlier.
It's been a very strange time, and with the best will in the world, this would be a tough challenge for any government of any political complexion. I think big mistakes have been made. I think the delay in entering lockdown to start with, that moment early on when Boris Johnson went out and shook hands with people very purposefully, sent completely the wrong message. I think, therefore, the extent to which we've ended up as an outlier in terms of the number of excess deaths is dreadful and has had a big economic impact on our country. And I fear particularly for young people. The future now looks much more uncertain for people leaving school and college, and that's a real worry, I think, for the future. So, look, it's been a really difficult period, and I just hope that lessons are learned now, because everyone expects a return of increased infection rates over the winter. We're already seeing it now. And it's just really important that we learn lessons and make sure that we also understand the consequences of lockdown for the future, for the economy and for young people. It increases the divide. If you're economically secure, as we are, then you can weather this storm. And for many people, it's actually been quite a pleasure, a sort of, a reset for people. I've seen more of my wife in 36 years of marriage. But what about all those people who don't have a job at the end of this, who have, destructive relationships and who face a very uncertain future? And that's the real worry for me, that how much it's increased the divide.
Bernard Jenkins, is one of the lessons to be learned that potentially the lockdown costs a lot in terms of healthcare for other illnesses, and also economically it's a huge price, isn't it?
Yes, and indeed that was why I think the government was initially reluctant to lock down, but I couldn't disagree with almost any word that Norman Lamb said, and nor indeed the comments that Sarah was making before about learning the lessons, holding people accountable and learning the lessons, and that's what I'll be doing on the liaison committee on Wednesday next week.
And do we need to do that pretty quickly? Because if we're seeing the cases rising, then things, is it, for example, a mixed message that we're seeing the further restrictions, yet still people are being encouraged to come back to offices, even when they don't necessarily need to?
I think the whole purpose of perhaps applying restrictions in a careful way is to enable more people to get back to work, is to make sure the schools stay open. It's not about throwing the economic recovery into reverse. If we can get the right kind of restrictions working in the right way, we can get back to a kind of normal that will help the economy back on track. So it is confusing. I mean, let's face it, we're all very confused about how this is affecting our lives in our country. It's a balance to be struck.
How damaging has this been for the economy in Luton when we look at terms of jobs?
Hugely damaging for the economy of Luton. I've just come from the aviation debate where we were talking about the need for a sector-specific support package for aviation, and not just the industry but for the towns that surround airports in particular, because this is impacting not just our airports, our airline workers, but it's also impacting our council services and all the charities and revenue that that comes from the airport. It's not just airport jobs and airline jobs, it's also the supply chains that go with it as well.
Is there a case for the furlough, you think, to be extended to certain sectors, more support for certain sectors that will hope to be back in business in 6 months, a year maybe, rather than right now?
I think that there is a case for extending furlough where it is clearly supporting industries that should become viable again in the short to medium term, and aviation could be an example of that. And I've had many discussions, I was going to say meetings, but of course we can't have meetings, discussions with the Chancellor about the bounce back loan system, for example, which he was initially reluctant to do, but eventually saw the light and we did the bounce back loans. We've got to remain open-minded about what needs to be done.
There are thousands of jobs that are reliant on the airline industry, not just in Luton but across the country, and this is important for our connectivity as well and our whole economy.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And if we look across the east of England, nearly 1 million jobs have been furloughed. I mean, how optimistic are either of you that a percentage of those, a good percentage, will be saved?
I think if the government acts now and is very clear and and creates confidence back in certain sectors, and confidence for consumers as well, to make sure that passengers know exactly what they're expecting. At the moment, we've got air bridges, but actually some of those have been one way. People have gone on holiday and found they've had to quarantine for 14 days when they get to the other end of it. And actually what we need now is confidence, clarity, and clear communication for what people can expect and what is expected of them as well.
But yes to all that, but don't underestimate the resilience of entrepreneurs and business people to adapt. I mean, everyone knows that Amazon's loading on new jobs because people are using Amazon. But I've got local farmers who've diverted what they used to produce for London restaurants into doorstep retail delivery businesses, delivering people fresh vegetables, organic meat, which was previously going into London restaurants, and creating a whole new business. And so, all kinds of things will be happening in the economy as we adapt, but the government's got to be there with a very benign view about how it can help.
And if we just go back to the restrictions announced yesterday effectively mean that, for example, a family of 6 couldn't have any visitors at all while they are in the house. How comfortable are you as a Conservative MP with that being put into law, those sort of restrictions?
This affects me personally. I live in a household with a group of family that is much more than 6, and it's very disturbing. The answer is we'll be able to meet other family out on walks. We'll be able to, in small numbers, go and visit other families, but it does feel very restrictive, and I don't like it. But I think we've got to knuckle down.
Well, the pandemic has dominated the headlines for months now, but Brexit is back up there. Emergency talks with the EU today as former Prime Minister and Huntingdon MP Sir John Major warns about Britain losing its reputation for honouring promises. That came after this frank admission from the Great Yarmouth MP Brandon Lewis, who's also the Northern Ireland Secretary.
I would say to my honourable friend that yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way.
If ministers think it is acceptable for this government to not obey the law, how on earth can the Prime Minister expect the public at home to do so?
Mr. Speaker, we expect everybody in this country to obey the law.
Sarah Owen, what did Labour MPs make of that when they heard Brandon Lewis make that admission in the House of Commons?
I think that sends a very, very dangerous message to the general public, not just about Brexit and future trade deals, and also our international message that the UK government is prepared to break international laws or agreements, especially when we're at this very sensitive stage of going out and negotiating future trade deals with other countries. But as we heard, it sends a confusing message again to the public that it's OK to break the law as long as you do it in a limited, specific way.
Bernard Jenkins, is it OK to break the law in this way?
Well, first of all, I was somewhat astonished at what Brandon Lewis said. He'd clearly been told to say it, and I wonder who told him to say it. I don't think he was very comfortable saying it. Secondly, I think you do need to make a distinction between the law and international law. There is no international law that is binding on UK citizens through our own courts unless Parliament says so. International law agreements between states is not the law of our constitution. And actually, the EU breaks international law all the time. Every time they slap punitive tariffs or get into a trade dispute with some other country, they could be construed as breaking international law. I mean, we're not talking about genocide or declaring war on other countries here. We're talking about really technical, minor things.
As Sarah says, we're at a very sort of the end stage of these negotiations for a trade deal to come into place in just over 3 months' time. Isn't this an astonishing... I mean, is this about having a row, or is what's the point of him saying this?
I don't know. You must ask the government why they made this statement and why we're likely never to hear it again. But I'm just absolutely clear that we need the provisions in the Act that he was referring to protect the United Kingdom national interest from ongoing interference of the EU courts, because we've left the EU.
This was a treaty that was signed by the Prime Minister just at the start of this year.
Well, it all depends what the treaty means, doesn't it? Why should the EU...
Let me just
make the point. Why should the EU have a monopoly of wisdom about what the treaty means and be able to impose it on us as their law, even though we've left the EU? You want to have sector-specific support, state aids for the aviation industry. under this agreement, the EU could declare it illegal if they think it's an unfair subsidy on our aviation
I think that's
industry.
incredibly that is hiding behind EU
No, that's
law
the fact.
to
That's
avoid
what you're in
responsibility.
favour of.
No,
You're
it's
in
not.
favour of.
To hide behind EU law for your responsibility to stick up for the workers that need it the most. There is absolutely you can get round it any way that you wanted to. If there was a willingness to do so, and there seems like a real lack of willingness to act on this.
The EU regularly declares state aids to be illegal.
We were promised that this was going to be one of the easiest deals in history. We were promised it was an oven-ready deal. We had pictures of the Prime Minister putting a pie in the oven and saying, this is it. What we've got now is chaos.
Well, Bernard Jenkins, is it the case that this is a precursor to no deal and that's what we're heading for?
Well, we might finish up with no free trade agreement. But that's not the end, because then we'll be subject to all these restrictions and potentially blocking state aids for the aviation sector in Luton. That's why this is so important. Now, some of us in the ERG, in the European Research Group, warned the Prime Minister that this was not a very good deal. We voted for it because there didn't seem to be an alternative. We got a sovereignty-saving clause into the EU agreement.
Do you regret voting for that now when you see what's
No,
happened?
I don't, because there was no other option at the time. But what we got into that act was a sovereignty-saving clause, which is just the same as what is being proposed in this act, this new act of Parliament about the internal market. All this bill is about, the new internal market bill, is about whether all goods in the UK should be treated the same throughout the UK. And for the EU to carry on interfering in our internal trade and our internal economic affairs is not Brexit, is it?
Are you concerned that this is a precursor to no deal and that's why we're seeing this round now?
I would be very concerned about seeing a no deal, and what it is there is further uncertainty. When I speak to businesses, whether they're manufacturers like Vauxhall PSA, for example, in Luton, what they want is certainty. They want to know what's going to happen in the future, and this has just thrown everything that we thought would be happening under the bus.
And just very quickly, because we've got to go, this will come to the Commons next week. Do you think there'll be a rebellion from... I've spoken to Conservative MPs who are very unhappy with the statement that Brandon Lewis made. Do you think there'll be a big rebellion amongst Conservative MPs on this?
I think some will rebel. There'll be the same old faces that tried to stop Brexit.
Thanks very much indeed. We'll have to leave it there.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for coming in. Anglia Late Edition is due back in October. Until then, we'll keep you up to date with all the latest developments in ITV News Anglia at 6 o'clock every night. Till then, very good night.